The cantina on Terminus 7 was thick with smoke and the smell of alien liquors. Blue and purple lights flickered across the metal walls while creatures from a dozen different worlds sat at tables scattered around the room. In the far corner, away from the noise and crowds, sat a group of young Zephyrian soldiers. Their scales still shone bright green, unmarked by battle scars. They wore their new uniforms with pride and talked loudly about their upcoming mission. "The humans will not stand a chance," said Veltar, the youngest of the group. His voice carried the confidence that only came from never seeing real combat. "Our plasma rifles can cut through their primitive armor like it is made of paper. Their ships are slow and clumsy," added Zekanol, waving his clawed hand in the air. "Our fighters are twice as fast. We will sweep them from the stars before they even know we are there." The other recruits nodded and clicked their approval. They had trained for 2 full cycles at the academy. They knew their weapons, their tactics, and their technology. Everything they had learned told them that humans were just another weak species that had somehow managed to crawl into space. Soon, they would be put back in their place. A shadow fell across their table. The recruits looked up to see an old Zephyrian standing beside them. His scales were dull gray with age, and deep scars ran across his face and arms. One of his eyes was milky white from an old wound. He wore a simple black jacket with no rank insignia, but something about him made the young soldiers fall silent. "Mind if an old veteran sits with you boys?" the stranger asked. His voice was rough like grinding stone. The recruits exchanged glances. None of them wanted to refuse, but they also did not want their celebration interrupted by some washed-up old soldier telling war stories. Veltar finally nodded toward an empty chair. "Of course, honored elder. Please join us." The old soldier sat down slowly and raised his hand to signal the bartender. "Crystal is my name," he said. "I could not help but hear you talking about humans. You sound very confident." "We have reason to be," Zekanol replied. "Our instructors have shown us all the data. Human technology is at least 50 years behind ours. Their reflexes are slow. Their bones break easily. They can barely see in low light." Crystal took a long drink from the bottle the bartender brought. "All of that is true," he said quietly. "I have fought humans for 30 years. Everything you just said is completely accurate." The recruits smiled at each other. Even this old veteran agreed with their assessment. "So why?" Crystal continued. "Are they still winning?" The smile faded from Veltar's face. "Winning? But the reports say we have achieved major victories." "We have won battles," Crystal said, "but we have not won the war." "And do you know why?" "Because you are thinking about this all wrong. You think warfare is about who has the better gun or the faster ship. But humans do not fight like that." He leaned forward and fixed his good eye on each of them in turn. "Let me tell you about Jake Morrison. He was just one human soldier, no special rank. No advanced training, just a regular human doing a regular job. My battalion was ordered to take Hill 347 on Kepler Prime. It was supposed to be easy. Our intelligence said there were maybe 20 humans defending the position." Crystal paused to take another drink. "We had 300 soldiers, plasma cannons, hover tanks, air support. The humans had some basic weapons and a few concrete bunkers that our heavy guns could crack open in minutes. Our commander was so confident that he barely planned the attack at all." "What happened?" asked one of the recruits. "We advanced up the hill in perfect formation, just like we learned in training. Everything went exactly as planned for the first 10 minutes. Then the explosion started." Crystal's scarred face grew dark with memory. Morrison had spent 3 days turning that hill into a death trap. He used their old mining equipment to dig tunnels everywhere. He took apart their vehicles and used the parts to make bombs. He even rigged their own water pipes to spray burning fuel. "But that is impossible," Veltar protested. "Our scouts would have detected any major defensive preparations. That is what we thought too," Crystal replied. "But Morrison did not build big obvious defenses. He used things that looked normal. A water tower that was actually full of explosives. Storage sheds that were really bomb shelters. Even their garbage dumps were turned into weapon caches. The old soldier's voice grew quieter. The worst part was not the traps themselves. It was how he used them. Every time we tried to advance, he would set off just enough explosives to kill a few of us and force the rest to take cover. Then he would go quiet for exactly 17 minutes. Why 17 minutes? Asked Zekanol. Because that is how long it took for our officers to get impatient and order another advance. Morrison had been watching us for weeks before the attack. He knew our tactics better than we did. He knew that our training taught us to keep pushing forward no matter what, so he used our own discipline against us. Crystal stared into his drink. For 3 days, one human kept an entire battalion pinned down. He never tried to win a direct fight. Instead, he made us afraid of every step we took. Every rock could hide a bomb. Every shadow could be hiding Morrison himself. But surely you eventually overwhelmed him, said Valtar. 300 against 1. We did, Crystal nodded. On the 4th day, we finally cornered him in his last bunker. But by then, we had lost over 100 soldiers. Our morale was broken. Half the battalion was jumping at shadows. And Morrison achieved something much more important than just killing us. The recruits waited for him to continue. He made us afraid of humans, not just him, but all humans. Because if one regular human soldier could do that much damage, what could a whole army of them do? What could they accomplish if they really put their minds to it? Crystal finished his drink and stood up. You boys have good training and good equipment, but remember this. When you fight humans, you are not fighting their technology. You are fighting their imagination. And that is something no amount of superior firepower can defeat. He walked away, leaving the young recruits sitting in uncomfortable silence. Their earlier confidence had vanished like smoke. Outside the cantina's windows, the stars seemed a little less friendly than they had before. The recruits sat in the cantina for several minutes after Crystal left their table. None of them spoke. The story about Jake Morrison had planted seeds of doubt in their minds, but they were still young and proud. Eventually, Veltar broke the silence. One soldier got lucky, he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. That does not mean all humans fight that way. Zekanol nodded quickly. Our intelligence reports show that most human tactics are predictable. They follow standard military procedures just like everyone else. The other recruits murmured their agreement, trying to convince themselves as much as each other. They ordered another round of drinks and attempted to return to their earlier celebration. But their laughter sounded forced now, and they kept glancing toward the corner where the old veteran had disappeared. 20 minutes later, Crystal returned to their table. He carried a fresh bottle and sat down without asking permission this time. The recruits tensed, but none of them told him to leave. Still think humans are predictable? He asked. Veltar straightened in his chair. We have studied their military doctrine extensively. They use standard formations and follow established battle plans. Crystal smiled, showing his yellowed teeth. Let me tell you about the Battle of Kepler Station. I was a squad leader then, part of a special forces unit tasked with hunting down human infiltrators. Our mission seemed simple enough. He took a long drink before continuing. Intelligence reported that a small team of human soldiers had landed on the planet's surface. Maybe 8 or 10 of them at most. They were conducting reconnaissance and sabotage operations against our supply lines. Our job was to find them and eliminate them. That should have been easy, said Zekanol. 10 humans against a full Zephyrian Special Forces unit. That is what we thought, Crystal replied. We had 40 of the best soldiers in the Imperial Navy, advanced tracking equipment, orbital surveillance. Everything we needed to hunt down a small group of humans hiding in the wilderness. The old veteran's good eye grew distant as he remembered. The hunt began at dawn on the first day. Our sensors picked up traces of human activity near the northern supply depot. When we arrived, we found evidence of a raid. Explosive charges had destroyed 3 fuel tanks and an ammunition storage building. Did you track them from there? Asked one of the recruits. We tried, Crystal said. But the humans had covered their tracks well. It took us 6 hours to find. Their trail leading into the forest. We followed it for another 8 hours before we lost it completely at a river crossing. He paused to drink again. That night, while we were setting up camp, the southern depot was hit. Then the eastern one. Both attacks happened at the same time, which meant the humans had split their forces. Or they moved faster than you expected, suggested Veltar. Crickstall shook his head. That is what we thought too. So we divided our unit to smaller hunting parties to cover more ground. It seemed like the logical thing to do. What went wrong? Asked Vikanal. Everything, Crickstall replied simply. Over the next 3 weeks, those humans turned our hunt into a nightmare. They seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. We would find evidence of their presence, but never the humans themselves. The recruits leaned forward despite themselves. There was something in the old soldier's voice that made them listen. They hit our supply convoys during the day and our camps at night. Sometimes they would attack 3 different locations in a single hour, even though those locations were hundreds of kilometers apart. Our commanders started to think we were facing a much larger force than intelligence had reported. Crickstall's scarred face grew grim, but the worst part was that they never seemed to sleep. Day or night they were always moving, always watching, always ready to strike. We started to feel like we were being hunted instead of doing the hunting. That is impossible, protested Veltar. No one can function without sleep for weeks. That is what I thought too, Crickstall said. But I was wrong. I learned the truth during the final week of the operation. He took another drink, gathering his thoughts. My squad had been tracking what we believed was the main group of humans for 2 days. We were exhausted and running low on supplies. But we finally had them cornered in a small valley with only one way out. We set up an ambush and waited for them to try to escape. I was on watch duty when I saw movement in the trees. Through my scope I could see a human soldier moving between the rocks. Crickstall's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I watched that human for 3 hours. She never stopped moving, never rested. Never even paused to eat or drink. She just kept circling our position, studying our defenses, looking for weaknesses. Stimulant overdose perhaps, suggested Zekanol. Humans are known to use chemical enhancement. I thought the same thing, Crickstall nodded. But then I realized something that chilled me to the bone. The human I was watching was not the same. One I had seen an hour earlier. The recruits exchanged confused glances. What do you mean? Asked Veltar. The first human I saw was a female with short dark hair. But the one I was watching now was also female but with longer, lighter hair. They looked similar enough that I almost missed the difference. But when I started paying closer attention, I realized they were taking turns. Crickstall leaned forward. Those humans had been working in shifts the entire time. While one group slept, another group stayed active. They were rotating so smoothly that it seemed like they never stopped moving. How many of them were there? Asked one of the recruits. We found out the next morning when they finally revealed themselves. 12 humans total, just 12. But they had been operating like they were 50 or 60 because they had perfected the art of coordinated rest. The old veteran finished his drink. The leader of their unit was a woman named Amy Rodriguez. When we finally met face to face during the final engagement, she looked like she had been awake for a month. Her eyes were bloodshot and her hands shook slightly from exhaustion. But she was still sharp, still thinking clearly, still dangerous. When I asked her how she had managed to keep her unit operational for so long without proper rest, she just smiled. Crickstall imitated that smile, and it was not pleasant. She told me that humans learned long ago how to function on minimal sleep. They call it micro-sleeping. Taking tiny naps whenever possible, 15 minutes here, 30 minutes there. Just enough to keep the brain working. She said her people had been persistence hunters for millions of years before they reached the stars. They were used to tracking prey for days or weeks without stopping. A few weeks of irregular sleep was nothing compared to what their ancestors had endured. The recruits sat in stunned silence. Finally, Veltar spoke. Did you capture them? Crickstall laughed bitterly. Capture them? We never even came close. By the time we realized what they were doing, Rodriguez and her team had gathered enough intelligence to compromise our entire operation. They slipped away in the night while we were sleeping. He stood up to leave again. Remember this, younglings. When you fight humans, you are not just fighting their bodies or their weapons. You are fighting millions of years of evolution that taught them how to outlast anything that tries to kill them. The old veteran walked away, leaving the recruits to contemplate his words. Outside, the night seemed longer and darker than before. The cantina had grown quieter as the night progressed. Many of the alien patrons had left for their ships or quarters, leaving only the most dedicated drinkers and the group of young Zephyrian recruits still sitting with Crystal. The old veteran had been gone for almost an hour this time, and the recruits had used the break to try to restore their confidence. 2 stories, Valtar said, trying to sound dismissive. 2 unusual situations that do not represent normal human behavior. Exactly, agreed Zekanel. Morrison got lucky with his traps, and Rodriguez had special training. Most humans are not like that. The other recruits nodded, though their enthusiasm seemed forced. They had ordered more drinks, but barely touched them. The stories Crystal had told were working on their minds like slow poison. When the old veteran returned, he looked even more worn than before. He sat down heavily and studied each of their faces. Still making excuses? He asked. We are being realistic, Veltar replied. Every species has exceptional individuals. That does not mean their entire military is dangerous. Crystal smiled without humor. Well, let me tell you about the siege of Titan Base. This was not about one exceptional human. This was about how humans work together when everything goes wrong. He signaled for another drink before continuing. I was a lieutenant then, serving under General Techmore. We had surrounded a human research station with 2 full regiments. The humans had maybe 300 Marines defending the base, led by a commander named Lisa Chun. The odds were in your favor, observed Zekanol. More than in our favor, Crystal agreed. We had superior numbers, better weapons, and complete orbital control. The siege should have lasted 3 days at most. The old soldier paused as the bartender brought his drink. General Techmore was confident enough to invite observers from the high command. They wanted to watch how efficiently Zephyrian forces could crush human resistance. What happened? Asked one of the recruits, though his voice suggested he was not sure he wanted to know. For the first 2 days, everything went according to plan. We established our siege lines, cut off their supply routes, and began systematic bombardment of their outer defenses. The humans fought well, but they were clearly outmatched. Crystal took a long drink. Then Shin made her move. She launched a surprise attack on our main communication hub. It was a brilliant strike that destroyed our entire command network in one coordinated assault. But surely you had backup communications, said Veltar. We did, Crystal nodded. But Shin had planned for that too. Her raiders hit every backup facility simultaneously. Within 6 hours, our entire siege force was operating in complete communication blackout. The recruits looked confused. That should have helped you, said Zekanol. Without communications, the humans would be even more disadvantaged than your forces. Crystal's scarred face grew dark. That is what General Techmore thought too. He assumed that losing their radios would cripple human coordination just like it was hampering ours. He was wrong. The old veteran stared into his drink as the memories came back. The next morning, Chun launched a full counterattack. But this was not like any battle I had ever seen before. How do you mean? Asked Veltar. The humans moved, like they were all part of the same mind. Without any radio communication, they somehow coordinated maneuvers that should have been impossible. Small units would appear exactly where they were needed, exactly when they were needed, as if they had been planned down to the second. Crystal's good eye fixed on each recruit in turn. I watched Chian herself lead a charge against our eastern flank. She never spoke into a radio, never sent a messenger, but somehow the moment she started moving, Marines from 3 different positions began converging on the same target. Lucky timing, suggested Zekanoa, but his voice lacked conviction. That is what I thought at first, Crixtal replied. But it kept happening. Over and over. The humans would split their forces, attack multiple positions, and reunite at precisely the right moments. It was like watching dancers who had rehearsed their routine for years. The old soldier took another drink. I started paying closer attention to how they were doing it. What I saw still gives me nightmares. They were using hand signals, he continued, but not simple ones like most armies use. These humans had developed an entire language of gestures that let them communicate complex tactical information instantly. But that still requires line of sight, protested Veltar. You would think so, Crixtal agreed. But somehow they were passing information through their ranks faster than our electronic communications had ever managed. A signal from Chun would ripple through her entire force in seconds. The recruits exchanged worried glances. This sounded impossible, but Crixtal spoke with the certainty of someone who had witnessed it personally. The worst part was watching them anticipate each other, the old veteran continued. Chun would start to point toward a target, and her Marines would already be moving before she finished the gesture. It was like they could read her mind. During one attack, I saw a human soldier throw a grenade without looking at his target. But somehow, his teammate knew exactly where it was going and was already moving to take cover behind the explosion. They had not exchanged any signals that I could see. Crixtal's voice dropped to almost a whisper. That night I realized something terrifying. These humans had been working together for so long that they had started thinking like a pack animal. Each individual was still independent, but they could instantly synchronize their actions when needed. Like hunting animals? Said one of the recruits. Exactly like hunting animals, Crixtal confirmed, but smarter than any pack predator that ever lived. Chun's Marines could switch between individual initiative and group coordination faster than we could adjust our tactics. The old soldier finished his drink. On the fourth day of the siege, Chin broke our lines completely. Not through superior firepower or clever strategy, but through perfect teamwork. Her Marines flowed around our defenses like water, always finding the weakest points, always supporting each other without needing to be told. General Techmore ordered a full retreat, Crixtal continued. But even then, the humans did not let us go easily. They harassed our withdrawal for 2 days, always staying just out of reach, always striking where we were most vulnerable. How many of your forces survived? Asked Veltar quietly. About half, Crixtal replied. But the casualties were not the worst part. The worst part was the report I had to write afterward. He stood up slowly. I had to explain to High Command how 300 humans with damaged equipment and no communication network had defeated 2 full regiments of Zephyrian soldiers. I had to tell them that humans do not just fight as individuals. They fight as something greater than the sum of their parts. And when they do that, they become more dangerous than any weapon we have ever faced. Crixtal walked away, leaving the recruits sitting in uncomfortable silence. They had stopped trying to make excuses. The stories were too detailed, too specific, too obviously true to dismiss. Outside the cantina windows, the stars looked cold and hostile. Somewhere among those distant lights, human forces were probably training together, learning to move and think as one. The thought made the young soldiers shiver despite the warm air in the cantina. The cantina had grown nearly empty as the night wore on. Only a few scattered patrons remained at distant tables, their conversations reduced to quiet murmurs. The young Zephyrian recruits sat hunched over their drinks, no longer bothering to maintain their military posture. Each story Crixtal told had stripped away another layer of their confidence. When the old veteran returned this time, he moved more slowly than before. The weight of his memories seemed to press down on his shoulders, like a physical burden. He sat down without speaking and stared at the scarred surface of the table for several minutes. There is something else you need to understand about humans, he finally said. His voice was barely above a whisper, forcing the recruits to lean forward to hear him. What now? Asked Veltar. The young soldier's earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by weary, Resignation. Crickstal looked up at them with his good eye. You have learned that humans are persistent and that they work well together. But there is something worse than both of those things combined. He paused to order another drink, though his movements were unsteady now. Humans see possibilities where no sane mind should see them. They look at ordinary objects and imagine ways to kill you with them. That sounds like an exaggeration, said Zikanol, but his protest lacked any real conviction. Let me tell you about Ryan Blake, Crickstal replied. He was an engineer aboard a human cargo vessel called the Memphis. Nothing special about him. Just a maintenance worker who fixed broken equipment and kept the ship running. The old soldier took a long drink before continuing. My destroyer squadron intercepted the Memphis in the Vega system. It was supposed to be a routine boarding operation. The cargo ship had minimal defenses and a crew of only 12 humans. Routine boarding operations usually are routine, observed one of the recruits. Usually, Crickstal agreed. But humans have a way of making routine situations very complicated very quickly. He stared into his drink as the memories came back. The Memphis tried to run when they saw us coming, standard procedure. But our ships were faster and we disabled their engines with the first salvo. The ship went dead in space, just drifting among the asteroids. We sent over a boarding party of 20 soldiers. I was the team leader. Our job was simple: secure the ship, capture the crew, and search the cargo holds for contraband weapons. Crickstal's scarred face grew grim. Everything went according to plan for the first 15 minutes. We cut through their airlock secured the docking bay and began moving through the ship corridor by corridor. Where was the crew? Asked Veltar. That was the first sign that something was wrong, Crickstal replied. We expected to find the humans huddled together in their emergency shelter, ready to surrender. Instead, the ship seemed completely empty. The old veteran took another drink. We split into 2 teams to search faster. That was our first mistake. The second mistake was assuming that a disabled cargo ship could not hurt us. What happened? Asked Zikanol. Blake happened, Crickstal said simply. We found out later that when our attack began, the rest of the crew had evacuated in escape pods. But Blake stayed behind to protect the ship. 1 human against 20 Zephyrian. Soldiers, said one of the recruits. Those odds should have been impossible. They should have been, Crickstal agreed. But Blake was not trying to win a fair fight. He was trying to survive long enough to make us regret boarding his ship. The old soldier's voice grew quieter. The first trap was in the cargo bay. My team was searching through shipping containers when the lights went out. In the darkness, we heard a strange humming sound. Then the artificial gravity reversed. The recruit stared at him in shock. Reversed? Asked Veltar. Blake had rewired the gravity generators to pull everything toward the ceiling instead of the floor. My soldiers were thrown upward into the metal beams and support structures. 3 of them were knocked unconscious immediately. Crickstal took another drink with shaking hands. But that was just the beginning. While we were trying to figure out what had happened, Blake activated the cargo bay's loading system. The mechanical arms that normally move shipping containers began swinging through the darkness like giant weapons. One of my soldiers was caught by a loading crane and thrown across the room. How could one human control all those systems simultaneously? Asked Zikanol. We wondered the same thing, Crickstal replied. Later, we discovered that Blake had spent the 15 minutes before we boarded rewiring the ship's entire automation system. He turned every piece of machinery into a remote-controlled weapon. The old veteran's good eye grew distant. The second team had their own problems. Blake had done something to the ship's recycling system. Instead of processing waste, it was now shooting projectiles made from compressed garbage at high velocity. Garbage? Asked one of the recruits. Metal scraps, broken tools, even food containers, Crickstal confirmed. Blake had turned the ship's trash into ammunition. The projectiles were not very accurate, but in the narrow corridors of a cargo ship, accuracy did not matter much. He finished his drink and immediately signaled for another. The worst part was the environmental controls. Blake had somehow rigged the air filtration system to release different gases into different sections of the ship. Poisonous gases? Asked Veltar. Not poisonous, Crystal shook his head. Much worse than that. In some areas, he released pure oxygen, making everything extremely flammable. In others, he pumped in nitrogen until our soldiers started getting dizzy from lack of oxygen. But the most terrifying section was where he had mixed cleaning chemicals from the maintenance supplies. The air became so corrosive that it started eating through our armor. The recruits exchanged horrified glances. This was beyond anything they had imagined possible. How did he know which gases to use? Asked Zekanel. Blake was a maintenance engineer, Crystal replied. He knew every system on that ship and understood exactly what each chemical in their supply lockers could do. What took us hours to figure out, he had planned in minutes. The old soldier's voice grew even quieter. The final trap was the most insane thing I have ever encountered. Blake had rigged the ship's entertainment system to broadcast a specific frequency that interfered with our neural implants. Suddenly, half my remaining soldiers could not coordinate their movements properly, and their cybernetic enhancements were receiving conflicting signals. Some of them started firing at shadows. Others could not tell which direction was up. He weaponized music, said one of the recruits in disbelief. Not just any music, Krikstal corrected. Blake had analyzed the technical specifications of Zephyrian military implants and calculated exactly which sound frequencies would cause malfunctions. The old veteran drained his new drink in one gulp. In the end, we did capture Blake, but by then only 7 of my 20 soldiers were still combat effective. The others were injured, disoriented, or had suffered equipment failures. When we finally cornered him in the engine room, Blake was standing calmly beside a jury-rigged explosive device made from engine coolant and ship batteries. He smiled at us and said he could destroy the entire ship if we took one more step. Krikstal stood up unsteadily. Do you know what the most terrifying part was? Blake looked completely sane. He was not a madman or a fanatic. He was just an ordinary human who had looked around his disabled ship and seen 1,000 different ways to turn everyday objects into weapons. He told me later that everything he used was just standard equipment found on any cargo vessel. No special military hardware. No experimental technology. Just common tools and supplies that he had learned to see differently. The old veteran walked away, leaving the recruits sitting in stunned silence. They had run out of ways to rationalize what they were hearing. The stories were too detailed and too specific to be lies. Outside the cantina, the night seemed full of hidden dangers. Every ordinary object around them now seemed like a potential weapon in the hands of someone creative enough to see its possibilities. The young soldiers found themselves looking at their own equipment with new eyes, wondering what deadly purposes it might serve in human hands. The cantina was almost empty now. Only the young Zephyrian recruits remained at their table, nursing drinks they no longer tasted. Hours had passed since they first sat down, full of confidence and eager for battle. Now they looked like soldiers who had already seen too much combat. Krikstal had been gone for nearly an hour this time. When he finally returned, he moved like an old man carrying the weight of the entire galaxy on his shoulders. He sat down heavily and stared at each recruit. In turn, his good eyes seemed to look straight through them. There is one more story, he said quietly. The most important one, the one that explains why we are losing this war. Veltar looked up from his drink. We are winning, he said automatically, but the words sounded hollow even to him. No, Krikstal replied firmly, we are not. And I'm going to tell you exactly why. The old veteran ordered one final drink and waited for it to arrive before speaking again. This happened 2 years ago at the Battle of New Ceres. I was serving as tactical officer aboard the flagship under Admiral Victor himself. Admiral Victor was considered one of our greatest military minds, he continued. He had never lost a major engagement. High Command gave him a fleet of 200 ships and orders to crush the human resistance in the Ceres system once and for all. Zekanel stirred slightly. 200 ships should have been more than enough to handle any human force. That is exactly what Admiral Victor thought, Crystal agreed. Intelligence reported that the humans had maybe 60 ships defending the system. Old vessels with inferior weapons and weak armor. The admiral was so confident that he invited military observers from 3 other species to witness our decisive victory. The old soldier took a long drink. The human fleet was commanded by Admiral Kate Sullivan. Victor dismissed her immediately. As just another primitive human who had gotten lucky in previous battles, he spent weeks planning the attack. Every detail was calculated perfectly. Our ships would jump into the system in 3 waves, surrounding the human fleet and crushing them with overwhelming firepower. It was a textbook strategy that should have resulted in complete victory within hours. Crystal's scarred face grew dark with memory. The battle began exactly as planned. Our first wave jumped in and took position near the outer planets. The humans immediately began retreating toward the inner system, just as our tactical models predicted they would. Admiral Victor was pleased. He told his staff that humans were so predictable it was almost boring. He ordered the second wave to jump in and cut off their escape route. Everything was going perfectly, the old veteran continued. The human ships were trapped between our forces with nowhere to run. Their formation looked ragged and desperate. Admiral Victor gave the order for the final assault. "What went wrong?" asked one of the recruits, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer would be terrible. "Nothing went wrong," Crystal replied. "Everything went exactly as Admiral Sullivan had planned from the very beginning." The recruits stared at him in confusion. "How do you mean?" asked Veltar. "The retreat was fake," Crystal explained. The desperate formation was carefully designed to look weak while actually positioning her ships for maximum effectiveness. Even the intelligence reports about their fleet size were wrong. Sullivan had been feeding us false information for months through carefully planted sources. She knew exactly when we would attack, how many ships we would bring, and what tactics we would use. The old soldier's voice grew quieter. But the worst part was not that she had tricked us. The worst part was how she had done it. Sullivan had studied Zephyrian psychology extensively. She knew that our military culture valued honor and direct confrontation. She knew that Admiral Victor would see a retreating enemy as proof of his own superiority. Crystal took another drink with trembling hands. She used our own pride against us. Every move we made played right into her hands because she understood how we would react better than we understood ourselves. When Admiral Victor ordered the final assault, our ships advanced in perfect formation just as Sullivan had predicted. That was when she sprang her trap. The human ships that had appeared weak and scattered suddenly moved with perfect coordination. Hidden weapon platforms throughout the asteroid field activated simultaneously. Most terrifying of all, 40 additional human ships decloaked behind our main force. The recruits listened in horrified silence as Crystal continued. In 15 minutes, our overwhelming advantage had become a death trap. Sullivan had maneuvered us into a position where our own numbers worked against us. Our ships were so tightly packed that when the humans opened fire, we could barely maneuver without colliding with each other. Admiral Victor tried to order a retreat, but Sullivan had anticipated that too. Her ships moved to block every escape route while continuing their devastating attack. She had turned our own tactical doctrine into a weapon against us. "How many ships survived?" asked Zekino quietly. 37, Crystal replied, "out of 200. And most of those only escaped because Sullivan allowed them to. She wanted survivors to carry word of her victory back to High Command." The old veteran finished his drink and set the empty bottle on the table. "When I was captured during the battle, I was brought before Admiral Sullivan personally. I expected to meet some kind of monster, but she looked like any other human officer. She was polite and professional. She even offered me medical treatment for my injuries. But when I asked her how she had predicted our every move so accurately, her answer chilled me to the bone." Crystal's good eye fixed on each recruit in turn. She told me that humans had been studying us for decades. Not just our military tactics, but our psychology, our culture, our basic thought patterns. She said that while we had been dismissing humans as primitive and predictable, they had been learning everything there was to know about us. They understood our weaknesses better than we understood our own strengths. The old soldier stood up, slowly using the table for support. But then she told me something even worse. She said that humans had been fighting for survival on their homeworld for millions of years before they reached the stars. Earth was not a kind planet. Everything there tried to kill them. Predators, diseases, weather, even the plants and bacteria were dangerous. But instead of making humans weak, this constant struggle made them into something unique in the galaxy. Crystal's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Sullivan called them persistence hunters. She said that human ancestors would track prey for days or weeks, never giving up, never stopping until their target collapsed from exhaustion. She told me that modern humans still carry those instincts. When they face an enemy, they do not just try to win quickly. They study, they learn, they adapt, and they never stop trying until they achieve total victory. Most species evolved as either predators or prey, the old veteran continued. But humans evolved as something different. They became the species that outlasts everything else. When you fight humans, you are not fighting a military force. You are fighting millions of years of evolution that taught them to see every challenge as a puzzle to solve and every enemy as prey to be worn down. Crystal walked toward the exit, then paused and looked back at the young recruits. Sullivan let me go because she wanted me to deliver a message to our forces. She wanted me to tell them that humans are not the weak, primitive species we believed them to be. They are apex predators who learn to use their minds instead of their claws. And they have been studying us like prey animals from the moment we first made contact. The old soldier disappeared into the darkness outside the cantina, leaving the recruits alone with their thoughts. They sat in complete silence for a long time, staring at their drinks and trying to process everything they had heard. Finally, Veltar spoke. "What do we do now?" Nobody answered. Outside the cantina windows, the stars looked cold and hostile. Somewhere among those distant lights, human forces were probably planning their next move, studying their next target, preparing to outlast whatever opposition they might face. The young soldiers had come to the cantina as confident warriors, ready to prove themselves against a primitive enemy. Now they sat as frightened recruits who finally understood what they were really facing. The humans were not just another species to conquer. They were the galaxy's most dangerous predators, and the hunt had already begun.